Microphone is OK. Good. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to be speaking today at React Brussels to tell you about enhancing forms with React Server Components. And this session is going to include mostly live coding with the goal of teaching how to work with forms and React Server Components in practice. So my name is Aurora. I'm from Norway, and I work as a consultant at Inmeta in Oslo. And I work mostly with web development, and I'm actively building with React Server Components in my current consultancy project. So let's begin by looking at the typical React single-page application. It's great. You have your React query, your React hook form, and all is well. However, client-side apps have their problems. So they run purely with JavaScript, and the entire application is constructed from JavaScript after the user opens the URL. So when working, for example, from a slow device or with a slow connection, it can take a really long time to download and execute this JavaScript to even load the page to fill out a simple form. And in addition, to submit data to a database safely, you would need a backend where you would also want to validate your data because relying only on client-side validation isn't enough. And even with server-side rendering in a framework like Next.js, you might still experience issues because you fixed your problem of blank screens by pre-rendering the pages, but you now have an even bigger dependency waterfall of server-side rendering the page, downloading, parsing, and executing the JavaScript, and then hiding the entire page before anything really works. And let's not forget the struggles of working with forms in the Next.js pages router. You had to manually create your own API endpoints every time you wanted to safely submit a form on the server. You would want to use a library like trpc to ensure type safety. And you might have to write a bunch of excess, messy code, especially to handle errors and loading states. So overall, this was not a good developer experience. So with React 19, which was announced as a release candidate at ReactConf in May, we get server components. And React Server Components only run on the server. So therefore, they allow us to fetch data asynchronously inside components and access all our backend resources. And they can reduce the bundle size by minimizing JavaScript sent to the client and let us build performant apps while maintaining an enjoyable DX. So what we want to do is use React Server Components to write performant, user-friendly forms without a lot of front-end complexity. And we're going to need a framework to use React Server Components inside, and Next.js with the app router is our pick here. Then we will be needing multiple other React 19 features that are already available in the Next.js app router. Server functions, the form component, use action state, use form status, and use optimistic. Server functions are defined with useServer and tells the framework, like Next.js, to generate a hidden post endpoint to a function. And this will allow us to call that server code from a component, for example, from a client component. And it will simplify the communication across the server boundary while providing type safety using RPC. The new form element is React's extension of the native HTML form, which builds on top of the existing methods. And this extension lets you create interactive controls for submitting information, as well as letting the action property call a function, for example, a server function. And the function path will automatically be wrapped in a transition, contain a hidden form data argument with the values of the form, and in the case of a server function, be called as an HTTP post. Use form status is a hook that provides information about the last form submission. So it must be used inside a form and can be used, for example, to disable a button or display the inputted data while a form is submitting. It enables progressive enhancement because without JavaScript, the button will still work fine. It just won't display any pending feedback. Then we have use action state, and it's a hook that allows you to update state based on the result of an action. It also supports progressive enhancement because it can allow the server's response to be returned without JavaScript and shown before hydration has completed. And it can be used, for example, to display error messages or other information returned based on the return value. Lastly, we have use optimistic, which is a hook that lets you optimistically update UI while a background operation completes. And this will let you keep the UI snappy by providing instant feedback to interactions. It can be used, for example, with server functions and form submissions, but also with other potentially slow operations, such as filtering based on route params. And this hook stands out because of its ability to seamlessly merge client and server state as the server finishes its update. So with that in mind, let's move on to the demo. I'm going to be coding a simplified version of something that I've made for my current consultancy project where we use React Server Components. So let's get started with that. So I'm here in the Next.js app router, and my setup is, well, app router and then Prisma as an ORM, and I'm using a local database and Tailwind for CSS. So the starting files here is this message box component. That's pretty much all there is. And it is a server component, which means it can be async, and it can asynchronously await messages by directly querying the database inside the component. And then it's mapping these messages into individual message display components, which really just style a message based on whether it's written by the user. And it also has a message input, which doesn't do anything. It's just a form with a single field, which doesn't do anything. So this is all now server components. There's no JavaScript on the client for these components. So what we want to do is enhance this with React 19, where the goal is going to make it interactive while minimizing the JS on the client and reducing the front-end complexity. And let's begin by making this form work. So we're going to use the React extension of the form component to bind this to an action. And it's going to be submit message to a function, sorry. And it's going to be a server function. So I'm going to put that inside my data access layer here and call it submit message. And since it's going to be a server function, we use the directive useServer, which will now expose all the functions inside this file to the client as hidden API endpoints. So we can export an async function, submit message, which will take in this form data parameter argument of type form data. And what this means is that each field in the form will be submitted inside the form data object with its value. And we can use it to insert into the database, create a message where the data will be the content from the form data. And then we also need a created by ID here, which means I need to somehow pass an additional argument to this server function. And there's a couple ways you can do that. You can use the .bind on a function, or you can use a hidden input, which is what I'm going to do here. I'm going to do hidden input, which is the name created by ID with the value user ID. I'll just import this. And now I can use this from the form data. And let's wrap this up. And I have to put a bit of a disclaimer here, because because you don't want to pass the user ID from the client side in a real app. This is just an example of how you would pass an additional parameter. You would probably want, or you would definitely want, some server-side authentication setup, like getCountUser on the server. But let's try this out. So I'm going to say hello. And I'm going to manually refresh the page, and now it's been submitted. But of course, I don't want to manually refresh the page, so I'm going to call Next.js revalidate path with the root path, which will tell Next.js to purge the cache and regenerate all the server components on this page. So now I can say hi, and it's been submitted and revalidated right away. So just by doing that, I have successfully submitted or inserted into my database from this form. And if I had used onSubmit here, I would have to wait for the form to be hydrated by JavaScript to be able to do the submission. But this is now working without JavaScript. But when I was submitting, I was like stuck in the scroll position where I can't see the next message. And I'm going to fix that by going to the message box component and replacing this div with an automatic scroller. And this component is a client component, because it's going to use an effect and a mutation observer to scroll to the bottom of the container when there is a new child inserted into this container. And this obviously requires client-side JavaScript, but since it's receiving props here, in this case children, but it could be any prop, it can still render server components inside. Let's try it out first by saying scroll. So it's scrolling. And if we check inside the console here, if I'm able to drag this, we can look in the React DevTools, and in the components, this is actually a new feature, you can see that these are server components. And the only client component here is the automatic scroller, which is pretty cool. Let's get back to the message input, because we're getting data from the client, and we really should be validating it somehow. So inside submit message, I'm going to validate my data and get a validation result from a message schema. And this schema will safely parse an object, which is going to be this object here. And I don't need to type these as strings anymore. And the message schema is using Zod to, at runtime, make sure that my object is of the correct structure. So for example, the content has to be at least 1 character long. And I can use this to insert into my database. And if the result did not succeed, we can throw an error and say invalid message data or something like that. So now when I comment out my client-side validation here and submit an invalid message, it will throw an error because, of course, it wasn't valid. And there's a bunch of ways to handle errors, but I want to use an error boundary for this. So in the message box again, I'm going to add an error boundary around my message input here. And import that. And now when I have an invalid message, it will be caught by that error boundary, just inside that certain component. But I'm just going to put this back, and I don't actually want to throw an error in this case. I would rather return something. So I'm going to return an object with an error, which is going to be this error, and a success false, and a timestamp. And you're going to see later why I need that. So I'm just going to create it. That's fine. And then you can also, by the way, return your per field validation errors and display them under each field, but I only have a single field, so I don't need that here. And maybe you want to do something else while you're on the server, maybe query the database and decide your next action based on something that you find out there. So in my case, I'm going to get the messages for the user by awaiting this get messages call again, this time with the user ID. And if this is, let's say, bigger than 5, we will say user has reached the maximum number of messages and return success false and the timestamp. And then we can safely insert into the database. And for some reason, if that goes wrong, we have the error boundary to handle that for us. Then we can revalidate the path and return success true. There we go. So now we have a bunch of server-side logic here. We need to get this to the message input and to the user somehow. And we can use one of these React 19 hooks for that. We're going to use action state. And it will take in a function to call, which is going to be the action, which will be our submit message. And we'll take in an initial state. And this will be just success false. And it will return a couple things. It will return a generated component state, which will be equal to first the initial state, and then afterwards the last return value of the function that useActionState is wrapping. And it will also return a wrapped action to call, which is going to be called here submit message action, which is the convention here. Submit message action. There we go. Almost. And I'm going to put this on the form. And I can use the state to display an error message down here. And I have a couple problems. So first, I'm trying to use useActionState, and this is a hook. I have to tell the bundler to load the JavaScript for this component with useClient. And I also have to fix this TypeScript error. So useActionState actually passes an additional argument to the function that is wrapping, which is going to be the previous state. So I'm just going to add it here, but I'm not going to be using it right now, which is going to be state. And then I have a type here, so you don't have to watch me write types. There we go. And now we're good. So let's see if that works. I'm going to say hello, hi. And then we hit this max message count, and the state has returned this, this error message that we can display in the input field here, underneath the input field. And that's nice, but I want to make it feel a little bit more interactive. So to do that, I'm going to use an effect. And if the state has an error, we can do a toast of an error with that error. And then we need to add the dependency array here, and we need it to depend on the error, but also the timestamp, so that this can rerun whenever the timestamp changes. And let's try it out. So we get the toast now, which is way better. So that means I don't need the text underneath anymore. But instead of removing it, I'm going to leave it as a no script fallback. So for some reason, if there is no JavaScript, we have this way to still show the message from the server. So now it will be not showing anymore. The next thing I have to handle here is the fact that when I get an error, my form is resetting. And the reason it does that is because with React 19, using form with an action and uncontrolled inputs, the form automatically reset when the action completes. And this is a good thing because it kind of copies this MPA form submission behavior. But in this case, we don't want that. And maybe you're used to making like a controlled form state using, for example, Formic or React Form. Well, now I'm using uncontrolled inputs. But I need to fix this. And I'm going to do that by also returning the content that was submitted from this function here. I'm going to say content. And we're going to use this as the default value of this input field. State, content. So if the state returns with content, it's going to be the default value of the field. We can say hi again, and now it's the default value because the state returned this. The server function returned this. So let's just, oh yeah, one more thing. When I'm clicking this, it's instant. But in reality, it's probably not that fast because I'm using a local database. And the round trip to the server and back could be kind of slow. So now it's actually taking me a while to see that something happened. And maybe I'm like submitting multiple messages by accident, right? So luckily, useActionState returns a third value. We can call it isPending. And we can use this to disable our button. And maybe say something else here. Like if it's pending, say sending. Otherwise, we're just going to say send. And now I will have this nice sending here, and I can no longer click multiple times. So let me just increase the max message count to 8 here so that we can get the successful version again. So 8, and I'm going to open this up. And now we're getting the status, the scrolling, and the reset. But what's good about this form is that it actually works entirely without JavaScript. So let me just disable the JavaScript here. Oops, I just switched to Swedish. That's OK. And let's try it out. You can say no JavaScript. So I did not get any pending feedback. I did not get any scrolling. And I got a full page refresh, but it still worked. Let's try again. No JS. It's working. One more. And now we hit this max message count again, and the no script fallback has been rendered instead, and we have our default value here. So let me just refresh and get back to the interactive version. Like that. Yes, we're good. So what we've essentially been doing here is progressively enhancing this form, which means we're making sure all the basic functionality works at the lowest level of resources, which is, of course, no JavaScript, and then adding things on top to enhance the user experience for the users that has these resources available. So let's say that the user is on a slow device and is waiting for JavaScript to download, parse, and execute. Well, now the JavaScript that they, this form will work before JavaScript has loaded, and the JavaScript that we do want loads faster because we reduce the JS on the client by mixing the server and the client together with this automatic scroller. So that means that depending on the user situation, they will have a better experience, but always have a form that works. I'm not done here because I want to talk about the reusability of this. Because it's a nice pattern to disable this button when the form is loading. But maybe the components I'm going to use it in don't use action state. And I don't want to write this logic every time. So I'm going to extract this functionality into a submit button. And I can just say send here. And I'm going to create this as a UI component. And make a new component here and paste in what I had. And that means I need to get the isPending from somewhere, right? And I'm going to use another React 19 hook. Use form status. And it will return to me a bunch of things. The data, the method, the action, and the pending state of the parent form that it's inside. And we can use this pending state here. And it's using the parent form as a provider to get these values. So it can be deeply nested, whatever, like that. And now I'm trying to use another hook. I have to make this a client component again to make this interactive. And if it is pending, we can render a nicely styled div here with a spinner and the children of this component. And otherwise, if it's not pending, we can just render the children. And then I need some props here, and add that to the component, and import the spinner. And in the real world, you probably want to extend the button props here so that you can add your area attributes, whatever. And maybe you want to add a loading boolean so that you can trigger the spinner without a form. But this is OK for our case here. So now I'm going to import this and see if it will work. So hello. And I'm getting this nice spinner now, which is pretty good. But the best part about this submit button is I can actually copy this and paste it into any component, even a server component. I'm going to paste it here underneath the header. And I can use it to, for example, reset the messages. I'm going to make a form with an action, reset messages. And I'm going to wrap that. And I'm just going to make this inline because it's faster. Reset messages. And this function is going to be a server function with useServer. It's going to be slow. It's going to delete all the messages from the database. And it's going to revalidate the path. And I have to make it async, not export, and import my stuff. There we go. So remember, we're on the server here in the server component, but the submit button is responsible for handling our client-side JavaScript for the pending state here. And let's try it out. So it's spinning, and it's resetting, which means that this button is actually entirely composable, which is pretty amazing. And one more thing I want to show you. So I'm going to get rid of this code and jump over to an optimistic branch. And I've actually been progressively enhancing this form further with another hook. So I'm extracted the messages into a new messages component because it's going to be a client component that's going to use the React 19 use optimistic hook. And this hook will take in a state to show when no action is pending, which is going to be our truth from the server here, and an update function. And the update function defines that on an optimistic update, we will spread the current messages and add the new message with an ascending true. And it returns the optimistic messages and the trigger function. And I can pass that to my message input. And here, I've actually added another progressive enhancement with the onSubmit here. So the action is still there, doing the same as it was doing before. But now I also have this onSubmit, if that's available. And the form is hydrated, all of that. And in here, I'm starting a transition, adding an optimistic message, and then doing the actual mutation. So let's see how that feels. So optimistic. So now I'm sending instantly, and I'm seeing this sending while the server is performing its update. I can try again. And what's happening is that as we have this client-side optimistic state, that's what is being shown, but then it will be thrown away as soon as the action is completed and the server has returned with its update. I can try again. So they're sending, and then they're settling. I can keep typing a few more until I hit this max message count, and whatever is not existent in the server state will be thrown away, because that's only temporary client state. Yes, I think that's it for my demo. But I'm going to explain some more, because the bottom line here is that depending on your application, you can now decide by your requirements and figure out whether you want React Hook Form or FormMake, or if you prefer to use these more primitive features of the web together with React 19 and server components to make very robust forms while still maintaining a good developer experience. Good. I'm going to jump back to my slides now. There we go. And actually, submitting forms with actions is not a new concept in the meta framework world. Remix has been building on the principle of progressive enhancement ever since they released the framework and enable it with their loaders, actions, and focus on web standards. SvelteKit and Nux also have somewhat the same thing, but of course, the frameworks each have different implementations, features, and developer experience. So the good thing is that what we've been learning is applicable outside Next.js as well. However, I would say that the Next.js way using server functions stands out by separating the action from the route, allowing more versatility and simplifying cases such as handling multiple forms in one route. So that wraps up the talk. This is the repo if you want to check it out. And there's a separate branch for the optimistic UI. And most of the stuff I've shown here is you can find it on the React docs or the Next.js docs, where the React docs are more in-depth and the Next.js does it in the context of the server. And please don't hesitate to ask questions or contact me on Twitter. Oops. And I also have a blog with RC stuff. So thank you for having me, React Brussels.